All right, everybody. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing with our tafsir, and this is where we left off at yesterday. So, we were talking about a very important figure, and we said we actually had stated a couple of quotes. We went back to a couple of his quotes. His name is Sahl ibn Abdullah al-Tustari, and we talked about basically some of his words. And we also talked about basically who he was in terms of his Sufi background. And one thing I would like to say, the influence about Sufism, many times we would see Sufism as one, but you're actually talking about in Africa alone, there are over 900 different tariqas in Africa alone. I'm not talking about Asia, but just Africa alone, there are 900 different tariqas. Perhaps Africa was was pretty much, I would say, the most hot spot for Sufi tariqas for a number of different reasons. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, a very important figure, and he wasn't just any figure, but he was a scholar as well, and he was a mujahid. So he definitely had a key influence in how Sufism grew and even its force in Africa alone, and to think of Sufism as nothing but a power that was always submissive to colonizing power, that is absolutely not true, because you had in fact most of the Sufi tariqas in Africa were also powers and jihad powers to fight against the French, to fight against the Brits, to fight against the different Portugal as well, and the different colonizing powers throughout history, not just modern times, but even previous times. But a lot of those Sufi groups, just wanted to say that. Even though Sahl ibn Abdullah al-Tustari was not necessarily at that time, or at least in the modern times, because remember, he basically died, I believe we had said 283 Hijriya, am I right? Or something like that. So don't take my word for it, but I just remember within roughly that time. Okay, let's continue some of the things, and we had said about bid'ah. So we said that that's an usuli question. Let me just clarify the point. Yesterday, when Humaira asked a question, I said that's a very smart question because that's an usuli question. What is an usuli question? An usuli question goes back to the foundation of knowledge itself. So what do we mean by usuli? We mean by usuli as think of it as the references for fiqh. Okay, think of it as this way. When you talk about medical studies, okay, the medical studies, there's the biochemistry that it based on and that it bases on. There's also anatomy. There's also, the what would dissect, or at least what would be, the background of all of those different doctors. There's basically, sometimes they would make a biopsy. The doctor might say, well, me looking at this illness or this lump or whatever it is, this looks like this is not cancerous, or it is cancerous, or whatever it is. But we're not going to depend on his words like that, just by him observing it. So they will say, you know what, let's do a biopsy. Let's take a small amount, a specimen, and send it to who? Well, send it to the pathologist. So the pathologist, they would basically put it under a microscope and see whether this really is cancerous or not, and then confirm what the doctors, or at least what the doctor on site was saying or not. The pathologists would be the ones to look deep down and lay out this whole diagnose and what really happens. Okay. At the same time, you have certain experts. They're not necessarily the ones that you would see at your clinic, but they would be the ones to also create the foundation of that study, whether we're talking about biochemistry, or whether we're talking about anatomy, and you've got a number of different experts. All right. That's in medical studies. Same thing if you were talking about fiqh, you would have those experts that are working in, let's call it the foundation. Those are the scholars that would be experts in Lugha Arabiya. They would be experts in Nasikh wal Mansukh in Quran. They would be experts in law terms and legal stuff and all of that. So they would be the ones pretty much working underneath. The ones that are doing the fiqh, they're answering questions. They're the ones that are on site, probably maybe a person that's working in the court or probably working in answering questions, on site, etc. Those would be the fuqaha. The usuli would be the one that's probably working in the field of perhaps maybe in a library, and they would be the ones to study and lay out the ilm of how the faqih is supposed to be understanding certain terms. This is an imperative verb. Does this actually mean that this is a must and this is obligatory or not? This is a verb that's giving me basically a prohibition. What does that mean? This is a word that also has what is basically considered as a compound word. What does that mean? How does it affect the sentence? How does it affect the way we would derive rulings? So they would be experts in Lugha Arabiya, they would be experts in Quran, they would also be experts in understanding the whole thing about even philosophy and logic. Okay? So they would be experts in all those fields. Philosophy, logic, Lugha Arabiya, Quran, and they would be experts that would be working basically underneath and laying out the rules and basically the laws for the person that is a fiqh expert. All right. Why did I get there? Yes. So when we're talking about bid'ah, that's the question that not a fiqh expert would necessarily answer, but an usuli would answer. So then we got into bid'ah and we said, well, bid'ah, in terms of the big, broad definition, we would say one group of scholars would say, well, the bid'ah is anything that the Prophet ﷺ did not do or was capable of doing. So the sunnah is two kinds. There's the sunnah fi'liyah and there's the sunnah tarkiyah. Let me write that down. Okay, so there's the sunnah fi'liya, okay, and there's the sunnah tarkiya. So what does that mean? There's something that the Prophet ﷺ had done, and that's basically the sunnah fi'liya. He did it. And there's the sunnah tarkiya. The Prophet ﷺ, was he capable of, I don't know, making a birthday for himself? Yes, he was capable of making a birthday for himself. Did he do that? Well, no, he didn't. That's a sunnah tarkiya. If he didn't do it, then the sunnah would be in what he had left. Now, anything that is not basically done by the Prophet ﷺ called ma'thur, I'm going to write that down, called ma'thur, for the first opinion, they considered, well, that is, if it's not ma'thur, then therefore it is a bid'ah. Okay, that's the first opinion between scholars. The second opinion, and those also went into multiple groups. Okay, the second, let's call it the master second opinion, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be ma'thur, but if I have a general text that gives me the permission, or at least the general permission that this is allowed, then it doesn't have to be ma'thur, meaning that the Prophet ﷺ had done it himself, but it can mean that it was something that, yes, it's something that can be based on experience, and you could say that I can based on my experience, it worked, and therefore we're using, let's say, for example, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad as a treatment, okay, as a treatment for somebody's paranoia, for example. For somebody's paranoia. What are we doing? We're doing Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad because this person is going through OCD. Well, how did you know that it cures OCD? I've done it before, and I had a couple, and this is not me personally. Somebody will answer, okay? Not me. Somebody will say, well, our uh, I'm a therapist, and I had a lot of patients that came with paranoia, and I would have them do Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad for a whole week for 1,000 times per day, and the results were actually quite shocking, she said. My results were quite shocking. This person, their paranoia reduced by 70%. Then the question is this a bid'ah, or is this going to be, well, her experience showed that it was working and therefore we can do it. Okay. Now, the first opinion would say, sorry, choose something else. This is a bid'ah. The second opinion would say, well, it's a form of ruqya. إن لا بأس بالرقى ما لم يكن فيها شرك. The Prophet ﷺ in a hadith in Sahih Muslim, as long as it doesn't contain shirk, and she's doing it and had the experience and it worked in treatment, then why not? Then that wouldn't be a bid'ah according to the second opinion. So we clarified that one. Okay, so does it have to be ma'thur, or can we, let's give another dua, just like yesterday when we said, yeah, subhanallah, by every single drop of rain and every single leaf on the tree, etc. They will say, why actually go into all this, this poetic way of making dua? Why don't you just go to the ma'thur? Subhanallah, عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. That's enough. Why go for this poetic dua that you made? We've gotten a better alternative. The Prophet ﷺ himself had done it, so go for it, ma'thur. Okay, now that's the first opinion. The second opinion will say, well, no. And that's one thing. I know some will definitely hate what I'm saying, which is il-burda. Okay, il-burda, I did talk about it before, but il-burda, is it containing anything shirk, or is it not containing shirk? So the first opinion, they will say, well, no, look at the words. He's basically calling the Prophet ﷺ as the Nur, etc. But then the other scholars that said, no, it doesn't contain shirk. You guys are misunderstanding the pronouns. These pronouns are referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not necessarily the Prophet ﷺ. Just like in certain ayat, like in Surah Al-Kahf, that the pronoun was referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the Prophet sallam. In some of the ayat, it might seem that this is talking about the Prophet sallam, but this is the context, is that it's referring to Allah Almighty. So the second opinion, most of those that adopted the second opinion, not all, because the second opinion, remember, there are different scholars and, different paths as well. So I just basically just made it into brief for you. But Il Burda, then you have some other scholars that will say this is yes, it is praising the Prophet ﷺ, but it's not also only praising the Prophet ﷺ, it's also praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they'll say and consider that this is a very poetic lyric in a very poetic poem for not only praising the Prophet ﷺ, but also praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you had some scholars that actually consider it as containing shirk, and therefore understood that those pronouns that of course were mentioned as praising the Prophet ﷺ, they understood that it's praising the Prophet ﷺ, overly praising the Prophet ﷺ. The other scholars, they considered that no, you misunderstood this praise. You misunderstood the pronoun. This is referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and even though you may misunderstand it at times, but let me explain. Okay, so now let's go back for Mustad al-Darimi, since we were talking about that piece. That's why that was more of a prelude to what story I'm going to be saying. Let's look at the story. So Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he came to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and then he said, Abu Abdul Rahman, who's Abu Abdul Rahman? That's basically Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had been Muslim way before Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he actually became Muslim before meeting the Prophet ﷺ. He was from Yemen, and it was basically Abu Musa al-Ash'ari and a group of from their tribe that became Muslim. And when they had attempted to go to the Prophet ﷺ, and ironically, the boat basically gets lost in the way, or they get lost in the way somehow, and they ended up going to Ethiopia. They thought that they were heading towards Mecca, but for some weird reason, they get lost and they go to Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, they basically meet Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and they meet basically the Sahaba that were in they were that were already in Abyssinia. So then they tell them that it was far too dangerous for them to go to Mecca, and that they should stay in Abyssinia and preserve their iman there. So if certainly they do, but Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was not amongst them. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was with the Prophet ﷺ pretty much all the time. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he had become Muslim. He was the sixth to become Muslim. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud definitely had a longer history in Islam than Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari later migrated in the around 7th, 6th year Hijrah, migrates to Medina from Abyssinia. And the Prophet ﷺ had said about Abu Musa al-Ash'ari that tomorrow you will be getting, and remember, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is sitting, I can't. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is sitting down. You had Umar ibn al-Khattab, but the Prophet ﷺ said, tomorrow you will be getting a group of men whose hearts قلوبهم أنقى للإسلام. قلوبهم أنقى. And he was talking about those, basically Abu Musa al-Ash'ari and his group. They had the softest heart for Islam, and this was a praise. There's not the most country that actually had the most praise in the ahadith is basically Yemen. In Yemen, its own people were praised. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Imanu Yaman, wal-Hikmatu Yamaniyya. Al-Iman is like the Iman of the people of Yemen, and wisdom comes from Yemen. And wisdom comes from Yemen. If you were to look at perhaps Bilad al-Sham, its own people were not necessarily praised as a general praise like the people in Yemen, but the place itself was actually praised as a place of blessing. Where's Bilad al-Sham? We're talking about Palestine, we're talking about Syria, we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Jordan. This is Bilad al-Sham. That's the Levant. And if, in fact, if you are to, if you were to visit those countries, you would see how very similar, whether we're talking about culture, we're talking about foods, we're talking about accents, we're talking about perhaps some history. You go to Tarablis in Lebanon, it's as if you're walking right at the heart of Old City Jerusalem, Al-Quds. You're walking in certain areas in Jordan, you feel like you're walking in Syria, or you're walking in Lebanon. It feels very, very, very similar. And that is Bilad Hashem, because even historically, they had a very similar country, very similar. It was pretty much all one. It wasn't until Sykes and Picot, basically, they were the ones, it was an agreement between the Brits and also the French that divided these countries into three different countries to create more and more divisions between the Muslim countries. But it was always one. But not a single country where its own people are praised like the people of Yemen. Speaking of which, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, the Prophet ﷺ had described him, قلوبهم أنقى للإسلام منكم. Their hearts are softer to Islam, basically, than any other group of people. So he came to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and he said, Abu Abdurrahman. Who's that? Well, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari calling Abdullah ibn Mas'ud Abu Abdurrahman. That was his nickname. And he said, I saw at the masjid yesterday something that you yourself had criticized, and I had seen nothing but a good thing. These people were just doing something good. And alhamdulillah, it's nothing but good. And he said, "What did you see?" He said, "Well, if you live long enough, you'll see it. But here's what I saw. I saw a group of people at the masjid. They formed a circle, and in this circle, they were sitting together waiting for salah. And every single circle, there was a man, and they had these rocks, and one of them would basically instruct them and say, make takbir for 100 times. And they would basically count the takbir 100 times using rocks to make sure that they don't confuse it. And then they would make 100 takbirs. And then he would say, make la ilaha illallah 100 times. La ilaha illallah. Okay, here we go. They're a group of people, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, taking one rock at a time. And they would do 100 times. And then he would say, make tasbih 100 times. Subhanallah, subhanallah, 100 times. And they would make that. And then Abu Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he said, well, what did you say to them? He said, well, I didn't really say anything. And I just wanted to see what you would think about this matter. And he said, why did you order them to count their sins instead and tell them that they are guaranteed to have sins and not necessarily good deeds? And then he walked. And they went with him, and then he went for each and every single circle of that circle that was done, and then he would stand on them, stand above them basically, and say, what are you doing? And they said, well, we're just basically collecting these stones, and we would do takbir. We would basically say La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, Tahleel is La ilaha illallah, Tasbih is Subhanallah, and we would just count it with these rocks. So that's when he said, well, count your bad deeds, and I'll guarantee you that you are not getting good deeds in replacement of this, but instead you're getting bad deeds. And then he said, "O nation of Muhammad, you are in such a scurry to distract yourselves. The Prophet ﷺ's companions are right amongst you, and they're available, and his own garments had not yet dried. In other words, they're even available. We see his clothes, we see his home, and in fact, even his utensils, they're not broken. And by the one that has my soul in his hands, إنكم لعلى ملة هي أهدى من ملة. You are following the creed and the guidance that is the best of the guidance, and therefore you would open up doors of misguidance." And then they said, "Oh, Abu Abdurrahman, we just wanted a good thing. We were just thinking of that this was going to be a good thing. It's just going to be just a reminder. We're just counting it. We just thought of creative ways, basically. In modern days, they'll use this word. They'll say it was just trying to be creative. And that's when he responded, وَكَم مِّن مُرِيدٍ لِلْخَيْرِ لَنْ يُصِيبَهُ. How many people, they attempt to do what is right, but the truth of the matter, they didn't get it. So in other words, that in order to get to what is right, you have to use the right path. If you're not using the right path, just with your intention that, oh, I just meant good. I was just trying to do the right thing. Just because you were attempting or trying to do the right thing, that doesn't mean you were doing the right thing, unless you basically follow the right path. You're trying to get good grades in school. Well, not unless you have the right way for studying, the right tips for studying, are you really going to get the right results. If you're getting bad results, well, that's a sign that you're doing it wrong and that you have to review and you got to change the system that you are basically doing things in because it's not working. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوا. And this is my path of the right path, then follow it. So therefore, how do we follow it? We basically follow the details of it. Let's see this one. Umar bin Abdul Aziz. The question, I know some of you are asking, So we shouldn't be using a tasbih, the tasbih, the subha, the one in beads and all of that. That's another place of differences of opinions between scholars. The first group, they considered that that's a bid'ah because the Prophet ﷺ never used one like that, even though it was something that they had seen people using it in Judaism. They have one as well. In Christianity, they have one as well, similar to that, and they would count. Certainly, the difference between the Jewish one, it has a certain numbers, but the Christian one has a cross on the end. But it pretty much is the same idea. Okay. Same idea. So it was available. The Prophet ﷺ did see something like that, but he didn't use it. So the first group of scholars, they would consider that it's a bid'ah. The second group of scholars, they will say, well, it's not necessarily a bid'ah, and therefore they would consider that, even the story that you basically had mentioned, they had said, well, هذا لا يصح. They said, well, this hadith is not an authentic hadith. The narration is not authentic, and of course they debated. You could see right there. You had some scholars like al-Mundhiri who said, well, actually, I've got some references right there. This is Hassan. الهيثمي in Majma' al-Zawaid, he basically said, guess what? I also was capable of finding that the chain of narration actually had authentic narrators, except one figure, Musa ibn Harun. Well, we could trust his narration, but not necessarily everything, but we could trust to a certain extent. But Ibn al-Jawzi said, sorry, we do not have a strong chain of narration, and therefore it is not authentic. Now, I want you to see this, okay? Because this story, you have one story, but then a group of some scholars would say its chain of narration is Hassan, which is really near we're really near authentic level, and you have those are experts, okay, in hadith. But you could say even these experts in hadith, like Ibn al-Jawzi in al-Ilal, or al-Haythami in Majma' al-Zawaid, who went over five different books, al-Bazzar and al-Tabarani, and went over the different hadith in Musnad and Ibn Abi Ya'la. So he went to a group of different books, five key books, and he was going over those hadith. And Al-Haythami did an outstanding job in Majma' al-Zawaid. Majma' al-Zawaid is one of my favorite books. It was like in 7 volumes. It was one of my favorite books because um, as somebody that is, trying to do an academic study, to go back to those books that already had done the job for you in researching whether this hadith is authentic or not, it makes a lot of difference. Maybe I can show you Majma' al-Zawaid. We need to see it. Okay. Definitely not want to see Trump as that, but sorry about that. Hold on. Majma' al-Zawaid. Okay. Let's go to Majma' al-Zawaid. I want you to see it, just get an idea. Okay. Here's Majma' al-Zawaid. Okay, now they have it for you in 4 volumes. The one in our library was like in 7 volumes. This was the copy. Okay, and here we go. Look at this one. This copy is actually in 12 volumes. Okay, so this is a new copy. The copy that we had in all our library was an older copy. So yeah, it was a yellow copy. Okay, so it was a lot harder to go through than this one. This copy, look at this. They'll tell you that those were all faharis right there. It makes things easier to research. Okay, so just for us to kind of see at least. All right, so you could see right there how this story about Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and the story of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud not liking the idea that they were using rocks to count. That's why the second opinion, they said, well, it's okay to count because the Prophet ﷺ had given us a couple indications where making takbir 34 times and making tahleel 33 times or making tahmid 33 times, etc. That was something that he was letting us know that there is some secret to the actual number of making tasbih. So whether you are using your own fingers or whether you are using perhaps beads to count, the second opinion said that's all right because the goal is one. The goal is to get to a certain number. So if we're getting to a certain number, then there shouldn't be a problem with it. And therefore, they basically depended on the general evidences. The general evidences. Now I want you to kind of expand your vision in understanding, well, why does one scholar say it's a bid'ah and the other scholar say it's not a bid'ah? I'm confused. So I'm letting you know the backbone, the premise that each and every single one stood on and why you would hear these conflicting answers. This is extremely important to keep in mind because many times people are confused about these conflicting answers and then they say, okay, are we getting multiple Islams here? Why can't we just agree? Remember, I told you, go back to the evolution of Muslim thinking, the series that I had done before, and it gives you certain information. And now you see that they might have differences of opinions, not only in how they derive a certain ruling from the resources, but they would sometimes have differences of opinions on validating a certain statement or not. Like this story, if it were to be valid and they all agreed that it would be valid, well, that would be a reference and a strong reference right there. Okay. But now you see this story and how we fit it within what we said bid'ah and what is the definition of bid'ah and how do we take that as, is it bid'ah to do or is it not bid'ah to do, and how do we answer that one? Let's see this one. Umar bin Abdul Aziz, we talked about him. We said he's like the fifth Khalifa, even though their majority of the scholars actually say there are four, but of course, there's a gap between him and in between Ali ibn Abi Talib. But again, he was regarded by some scholars as the fifth Khalifa. Anyhow, سأله رجل عن شيء من أهل الأهواء والبدع فقال عليك بدين الأعراب والغلام في الكتاب والغلام في الكتاب ولها عما سوى ذلك. Okay. So Umar bin Abdul Aziz was asked about the different people that basically would engage in different innovations. And he said, go to and adopt Din al-Arab, the religion, in other words, the tradition of those that were away from the city. Why is this even important? I'm gonna let you, I hope we have younger girls here. Let me explain something. As an ex-chaplain, we had a lot of girls and especially in America. In America, we have a lot of confusion. This confusion really started at a culture in America, whether you're talking about, the way Americans adopt religion is a way that yesterday I was actually reading a book for James Turner. He was talking about religion and how religion evolved in America, and how people were separating from the religion. And one of the key things was how they regarded the foundation of truth. In other words, epistemology, how they regarded what the foundation of understanding how and what makes something right and wrong, and morality, and what defines it, and what defines research, and what defines foundation, and all of that. And then that affected how they would relate to religion. I would say, even though James Turner's book was actually published in 1985, and of course, that was one of the most important books to pretty much analyze the history of religion, at least the history of atheism in America, and how people were starting to detach from the traditional religion into making new forms of practicing religion. I would say the same type of culture influenced the Muslims that are living in the US. The same reason that the culture within the US is making new ways of understanding, adopting new ways, whether it's science or whether it's, hey, that centricity is called existentialism. I've got my own self. I'm free to do whatever I want. Therefore, I'm an individual. I have my own understanding. I have my own freedom. I have my own personality. I have my own. It's all about the individual. Okay, so that culture becoming prevalent, it basically affected the way that they would study religion, including the Muslims. They would be in the US and thinking that, hey, we are different, our take is different, the way we would relate to the way we would relate to culture, religion, etc. And right now Gen Z is coming in with all this mindset, and they would say, well, we have different views of things. And of course, pride is fed to these ignorances, and they would think, تأخذه العزة بالإثم. They're basically proud of their aberration, and thinking that, hey, we've got something that the previous nations, the previous groups did not have. And unfortunately, we're seeing more aberration, more innovation, more deviation in the Muslims that live in America, perhaps more than any other place. More than any other place, including dua. Why am I saying that? Because one main reason is the culture of, I would say, epistemology in America, the culture that is based on individuals, the culture that is based on existentialism, the culture that is basically based on our own experience. Therefore, we don't necessarily have to adopt the tradition, and we can adopt new ways of reading the text. New ways of reading the text, new ways of understanding the text, and therefore we can adopt new ways of, one, spirituality, new ways of tradition, new ways of thinking, new ways of reading the text. And that's the same thing when we're talking about postmodern feminism and so forth. And we're seeing, sorry, ladies, but we're even seeing women, and unfortunately, sorry, ladies, I'm a woman like you. Okay, this is not a misogynist thing, but this is to describe the reflection, a reflection on what's actually happening in the women's corners. The women's corners, we've got more women dua that are right now on the rise and becoming public speakers, becoming those public figures that would bring about a new interpretation to the religion, and basically say, well, it is to abandon the misogynist interpretation, and what they end up really bringing, a feminist interpretation. Misogynist interpretation is definitely not Islam, and neither is a feminist interpretation. Not this one and not this one. But you are more likely to commit a deviated interpretation in adopting a new interpretation that al-A'rab, or at least the tradition, did not do. Keep that one in mind. Let's do it again. So, your parents, your grandparents have a better understanding of Islam than you. That's basically what we're trying to say. The older generations, they had a better Islamic practice and a better adoption to basically the vision of Islam. And what I mean by that is the mindset. And you know what? Let's even go further. If you were to go to primitive places like probably Mauritania, where they're not even electricity available, nothing, they have a better practice of Islam than perhaps the Muslims in advanced countries like the US, or probably in those areas. So in other words, if you are to go to the rural areas in probably Turkey, Colonia maybe, you would have better Islamic practice than perhaps Istanbul itself. Even though you might have people with PhDs, people with this, but they'll have a better practice that is basically trying to be on the fitrah. Same thing if you were to go to the country in different areas, rural areas, maybe in Afghanistan, maybe in Pakistan, maybe this, you'll have better practice of Islam and a better vision than the ones that probably are in the city. Just keep that one in mind. So when you look at all of this, the Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was actually saying, you know what? Go back to those that are in the rural areas that didn't have all this influence. Let's see. We'll get to that one. We'll get to that one, inshallah. All right. When you're looking at Bidin al-Arab, does that mean that everything that is in the rural areas or probably in those areas is necessarily better? Absolutely not. But I'm talking about a connection. I'm talking about a vision, okay? This is what I'm talking about. Okay, not everything that is in the rural areas is necessarily better. In some areas in Indonesia, rural areas in Indonesia, they're actually worshiping dead and they call themselves Muslim. Does that make it better? No, there's something definitely, these people need another Fath Islami, man. There's something, okay? Some are actually Muslim. All right, let's continue. And الغلام في الكتاب. What is it? So we're talking about الكتاب meaning the younger children that are just كتاب that are just basically that are just learning their deen and they're taking it basically in its simplest format and certainly, not with all the different additions, but they're just learning their Islam. And وَلْهَ عَمَّا سِوَاهُ and leave everything else. Okay, now let's see here, right here. Al-Awza'i basically said, Iblis says to his own people. Now, of course, this is a metaphor right there. قال إبليس لأوليائه من أي شيء تأتون بني آدم فقالوا من كل شيء. قال فهل تأتونهم من قبل الاستغفار قالوا هيهات هيهات ذلك شيء قرن بالتوحيد قال لأبثن فيهم شيئا لا يستغفرون الله منه قال فبث فيهم الأهواء. Now, one thing is that this Al-Awza'i was a scholar that lived in Lebanon, by the way. He's a Lebanese scholar. And we actually talked about him. We said Al-Awza'i um, died of carbon monoxide. He was an older man, and uh, of course, in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ had forbid that we would sleep with fire being on. But he was an older man, and it looks like he fell asleep and the fire was lit on, kind of like, like a barbecue type of thing. Not that they were using it necessarily for barbecuing, but it was used for basically warming up the place. Remember, Lebanon in the winter can be really cold. Okay, so they were basically warming the place, but of course, this was still there. He fell asleep, or who knows what happened, but then he basically died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, Al-Awza'i was a great scholar, and he said Iblis would say to his followers, from what are the things it's kind of like a demonstration right there. What would you do to influence the children of Adam? And in other words, kind of like, Iblis giving instruction to his own followers and his own people. And they would say, well, we actually use every single method that we could come to them. And then they were asked, well, do you come to them through istighfar? And they said, well, this is a far place, but this is something that was قُرِنَ بِالتَّوْحِيد. That was something that was like a compound of tawheed, a compound of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he said, I will then do whatever I can spew in them to not make istighfar. Okay, so what? What did he spew in them? فَبَثَّ فِيهِمُ الْأَهْوَاء. So then he spewed in them their own desires. So desire, so the best thing that you could do is astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Say it as many as you can because astaghfirullah is going to help you get empowered away from getting dragged into desires. Getting dragged into desires. Once you're in desires, then you're not going to be connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and istighfar, and you're going to see yourself getting into the different paths away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's see. And of course, Mujahid, he used to always say, I don't know what is the biggest praise that I was blessed with. Is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided me to Islam, or is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected me from the people that basically follow desire? So in other words, both are the same thing, because if you are away from the people of desires, you're going to have your heart basically close to Islam. That's one key thing. But if you're a Muslim, but you are following the people of desires, you're hanging out with them and you're just talking like their talk and you're just watching their kind of movies, you're listening to their type of music, you're following them on social media, and hey, you're them. You are part of them. So how to be a Muslim? Make sure you don't follow them on social media. Make sure you don't hang out with them. Make sure you don't subscribe to them. Make sure you don't even listen to their type of music. Probably hang out with them, talk to them. Don't make them as friends. Don't even hang out within their area because guess what? They do mirror you. You mirror, it is part of your brain that you mirror the person that you hang out with. You mirror their type of conversations, you mirror their behaviors, you mirror their ambitions, you mirror I guess the most important thing that they consider is the most important thing. You mirror them without you realizing they will have an influence on you. Let's see right there. Let's go to Sahel. Sahel, he was asked about praying behind al-Mu'tazila. Or even, okay, let me just give you an idea about al-Mu'tazila. Al-Mu'tazila, they have their own interpretations in Aqidah. They are Muslim, okay? But you had some great scholars that were considered Mu'tazila, just like Az-Zamakhshari, uh, Mu'tazili, and one of the greatest scholars of Mu'tazila too. And a great group you had a great group of Mu'tazila that also, of course, Ibn Ata, and he was the key thing, uh, key figures within, of course, Mu'tazila and their influence. And let's see, he was, or at least Sahel ibn Abdullah, he was asked about getting married from them or even praying behind them. And he said, don't pray behind them. And he said that they are kuffar. But I would like to say one thing. Um, are they necessarily kuffar? Of course, majority of the scholars they considered that there was a bid'ah kufriya. There are two things. There's a bid'ah kufriya and there's a bid'ah that is not kufriya. Let me explain right here. What does that bid'ah kufriya actually mean? So when we're talking about bid'ah kufriya, they may question things on aqidah, things like al-qadar, things like the decree that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically mentioned al-qadar. How do I understand it? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is he everywhere? Is he in one particular place? Do we understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his sama? Do we understand that people, when they commit sin, do they become kafir or are they still Muslim? Do we understand that the Quran, was it created, not created? Those are the type of questions that they debated. Why did they even debate these questions? It was really an influence from the Greek philosophy that they questioned everything. They used basically the Greek philosophy and adopted that, and then they started making questions because the Greek philosophy is all about being skeptic about everything and then questioning everything. Yesterday I was listening to a podcast for one key and very important Islamic figure. Okay. And he was asked, well, what is the most important question that you did not answer? And he said, well, I couldn't answer who I am. I said, what do you mean? He said, okay, well, let me ask you this question. Who are you? And he said, my name is Muhammad. He said, well, does that mean if I were to change your name, that changes who you are? He said, no. But that's a very silly question and a very silly answer too, even though it's coming from a very important Islamic figure, but it's a very silly question, a very silly answer as well, because you are not necessarily the name, but you are basically a combination of what you carry in terms of yourself, in terms of your body, in terms of your thoughts, in terms of what's in your heart, in terms of your character, in terms of your DNA. All of these are a combination. It doesn't have to be one answer to say, well, yeah, my name is X or Y, and therefore this is what I am. And therefore, if I had to change my name, I mean, it's a very, this is not a logical answer, not a logical question in that way either. But, these are the types of questions that, of course, sometimes people that are influenced studied certain things on philosophy and then they would apply it in their own day-to-day life, and then they would think that, oh, it's because it's making a smart question or making a smart answer or making this. It's not being smart. It's basically sorry, but it's actually going into what is called the sufsata'iyya. You're just really thinking that, oh wow, I'm making a smart question or making a smart answer, or I'm trying to deconstruct everything. You're not deconstructing to making a better construction, but you may sometimes be deconstructing. And the truth of the matter is that you're confusing yourself and not making yourself understand things better. And that's exactly what, at that time, they tried to deconstruct the question and ask the question, is the Quran a created book or not? And then that's that question that, of course, divided the Ummah and wasted their energy for a couple years, for a couple hundreds of years in people's lives. And scholars like al-Bukhari, like Ahmad ibn Hanbal, like many other scholars, they basically were abandoned for some time because they refused to even get into these types of questions, because deconstructing that, al-Quran is kalamullah. Getting into such questions and thinking of it as being smart is actually stupid. That's their take on that. So, of course, these questions were occupying a great deal of, I guess, a great deal of discussion, a great deal of debate, a great deal of controversy within the Muslim community, and it wasted their energy. Okay, and part of these were basically the Mu'tazila that basically got into this whole debate and fueled this debate. And unfortunately, of course, then that raises the question, those that did not want to engage in such a debate and just said, well, Quran is just the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To describe it as created or not created, it's a wrong question for the wrong thing and giving a wrong answer completely. It's Al-Quran Kalamullah, just leave it at that, and questioning, well, what does al-istiwa mean? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala everywhere? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in one particular place? Does that mean, how old is Allah? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala qadim? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala azali? Is Allah, and all these different questions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond anything of nature. Therefore, we don't have the tools to study or even understand every single thing about ghaib, so we just leave it at that. But of course, that's not the take on Mu'tazila. They wanted to question everything and thought it was smart to do so. And of course, they said, well, is Jannah, is it created or is it not created? Is And how do we relate to all of that? And no one from the mu'mineen would enter Jannah. Will Fir'aun eventually enter Jannah? Will the people in hellfire eventually enter Jannah? Or will the people that committed a sin from the Ummah Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam enter Jannah? Or is Adab al-Qabr, is it real? Is it fake? Is it metaphorical? Are we going to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Judgment Day? Is this extra? Is this not going to happen? Are we going to be completely different creatures? Or are we going to be really the same creatures that we are right now? And therefore, be capable or not capable of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and so forth. Okay. Now, this is, of course, this is the debate that they were basically discussing. And certainly it was an influence. And this is really important. Just like we were talking before about the influence in many of the Muslims in the US and how they adopted the same culture that was prevalent, that affected the Christianity in America. I would say the Muslims were affected by the same culture, and we're seeing new interpretations to the religion. We're seeing new ways of practicing Islam, and we're seeing people that are thinking that, yes, I'm basically trying to be American, but I'm also a Muslim and I'm trying to make a new thing. And especially with this LGBT right now on LGBT, at least at one point it was on the rise. Right now, Trump, was like, you know what? We're going to stop this and we're going to bring an end to this. And well, he did a great job in that one, but then did a horrible job on so many other things. But anyhow, it's a different conversation. But at the end of the day, is that certainly Muslims and living amongst that culture definitely had its great influence. Same thing that the Muslims at one point getting the books from the Greek philosophy or even those different cultures that they were now adjacent to. They were close to the Persians, close to the Christians, close to the Greek, and etc. And that started bringing in some influence, and that basically influenced their aqidah, influenced their aqidah, influenced certainly their practice, their legislature. So how do we deal with these people? How do we deal with it, with all of this influence? So this is extremely important to say, and hold on to the Quran and Sunnah. Yes, definitely. Traditional studying is extremely important because the more modern, and of course you will have more influence, whether it's from the feminist or whether it's from the liberals or whether it's from the Western, whatever you want to call it, etc., then you're definitely getting distant from away from Islam and not getting closer. And this is extremely important to say. The mindset of Islam has to go back all the way to al-wahy. إن يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس ولقد جاءهم من ربهم الهدى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it really easy. They would follow speculation, whether it's called theory, whether it's called a new reading, whether it's called a new way of seeing things or whatever it is, or whether it's called, it's a feminist way, it's advocating for this, and they'll give it different rhetorics that may make them comfortable with themselves. But the truth of the matter, it's a deviation and of a deviation away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. You want the pure Islam, you go back to the Quran and Sunnah. You want the pure understanding of Islam, you go back to those old books, those old basically resources, and not the new interpretations, because you're more likely to get into the influences of that particular time and think yourself as being objective when the truth of the matter, you're just being subjective, and you're just being basically, you're just being influenced by a lot of these modern, new, liberal, whatever it is, influences. And then you're going to find yourself really thinking that you're following them when the truth of the matter, you're just being deviant. You're just living in a self-manipulation, feeling good about your ideas, and then thinking that, okay, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا. But the truth of the matter is that you confuse yourself and you follow something else. Okay, let's see. Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad. It's a key figure, and we talked about الفضائل ibn Iyad before. And okay, he said من أحب صاحب بدعة أحبط الله عمله وأخرج نور الإسلام من قلبه وقد تقدم هذا من كلامه وزيادة. Okay, well, we did talk about this before. Okay, let's see. الفضيل ibn Iyad, he said, if you love somebody that is a bid'ah practicer, then you're going to find your actions basically going wrong and the light of Islam basically leaving your heart. Okay, so what is Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad? Now, just a reminder, Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad was an ex-Gain member. Yes, he was an ex-Gain member. And when he repented, that's when that was the main change in his life. And when he repented, then he started learning Islam and basically started, on the path. He was about 26 years old, about 26 years old. And that's when he started getting basically the ilm after his repentance. Okay. Why am I even saying that? Because when you talk about man ahabba, loving somebody that is a bid'ah maker or a bid'ah practicer, without you realizing, you are, the Prophet ﷺ said, al-mu'min, يحشر المرء مع من أحب. You will be resurrected with a person that you love. Therefore, it's extremely important to know who really is your celebrity, who really is your friend, who do you hang out with, who is the person that you love, because they will mirror you. They will have their influence on you without you realizing. So by being selective in who you hang out with, you're being selective in choosing your path, and you're being selective in choosing who will influence you, either making you a better person or a worse person. In other words, you have to choose the people that you hang out with, because they will have their influence on you. And loving a certain person, it basically starts with that. He said, you love a person of bid'ah, your actions, أحبط الله عمله. Their actions will be basically dismissed in the good deeds. In other words, the good deeds will basically just get into complete demolition. They will all go away. Why? Because you will then start adopting a new way, and then you will basically lose your خاتمة. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. أخرج نور الإسلام من قلبه. They'll also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also take by the person, the wrong person of bid'ah or the deviant person, the light of Islam will go out of their heart. How does the light of Islam exit their heart? The light of Islam exits their heart because they'll basically replace it with something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not teach. They'll use different methods. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوا. Sufyan al-Thawri, he said, البدعة إلى إبليس البدعة أحب إلى إبليس من المعصية. He said, innovation is something that Iblis likes even more than sin, because sin, you can repent from it, but al-bid'ah, you cannot repent from it. Well, that's Sufyan al-Thawri and him basically saying that, but does that mean if somebody was committing a bid'ah, you cannot make you can't make a repentance? That's it? You're doomed? No, 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 no. That's not what he means. But he was basically saying that al-bid'ah itself, you end up not even recognizing that it was a sin and that it was a wrong path, and you end up not feeling compelled to even make istighfar, because you didn't even recognize that that was wrong. So you don't feel compelled to make istighfar. But when you commit a sin, you would feel compelled to make istighfar because you recognize it's a sin. But in bid'ah, it camouflages in an appearance of a good deed. And then you end up not being compelled to basically do istighfar. Ibn Abbas, he basically said, النظر إلى الرجل من أهل السنة يدعو إلى السنة وينهى عن البدعة عبادة. That's quite interesting. What is he saying? And just looking at a person from Ahl Sunnah, it basically would compel you to practice Sunnah. And then it would also basically motivate you to not practice any bid'ah and get into that. Okay. All right, I'm going to skip some things, even though I love what we're doing, but I promised that I would end at 12:30 because of your time, okay? Because you already had a class. So I'll end right here and continue tomorrow, inshallah. Any questions? I know someone asked in the chat whether reading Quran for the dead is actually a bid'ah. So for the first opinion, yes, it is. For the first opinion, they would regard that, yes, it is a bid'ah. Why would you regard a bid'ah? They said, well, the Prophet ﷺ didn't go and read Quran for the dead. The Quran was a legislature for you as a living person, not for the dead. For the second opinion, those scholars, they said, well, sorry, but no, we do actually have some evidence that you can read the Quran for the dead. Really? What evidence do you have? They said, well, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنُ آدَمَ قَطَعَ عَمَلُهُ إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ. If the son of Adam dies, then their actions would basically be terminated except from three things. But well, number one is علم ينتفع به الناس. uh, education that people are benefiting after they're dead. Two, ولد صالح يدعو له, a person uh, that is his offspring, basically his own son, making dua for him. And number three, صدقة جارية, a sadaqah that's an ongoing sadaqah. And they said, well, we've got another set of good deeds that people can do. And the Prophet ﷺ, when that woman came to the Prophet ﷺ, said, "Inna ummi nadarat an tahujj, afa ahujju anha." My mother uh, had made the oath to make Hajj, but she died. Should I make Hajj on her behalf? And the Prophet ﷺ asked her, if your mother owed money to a person, would you be obligated to basically pay the debt? And she said, yes. He said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's dayn, daynullahi ahaqqu an yuqda. Daynullah ahaqqu an yuqda. Allah, paying back Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's debt is more important and prior to people's debts. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man mata wa alayhi siyam sama anhu waliyuh." Whoever dies and has siyam makeup to do, then his own wali would make siyam uh, basically on their behalf. Okay? Now, scholars actually, this in the second opinion, the first opinion, of course, they said, that's a bid'ah final statement. There's no way. That's it. In the second opinion, they said it's not a bid'ah to read the Quran for the dead. They're dead people. Somebody died, and each and every single one will give you 30 juzu. Each one, you're going to complete this juzu on their behalf. We're going to read this. We're going to read this Quran for this dead person, okay? And we're going to basically give each and every single one of you one juzu. And we got 30 people, so yeah, let's do it right now. In 20 minutes, here we go, as if you just read the Quran, the whole Quran. Can we do that? So, according to the second opinion, yes, you can. Why? They said, well, I mean, if you look at the first hadith that we had just mentioned, the Prophet ﷺ, إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنُ آدَمَ انقطع عمله إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ, that wasn't necessarily limiting it to there. Why not? Why don't you consider that as limiting? They said, well, look, we've got the man mata عليه صيام, the one who dies and basically has siyam to make up, or the one that basically has Hajj to do. They would still be rewarded for people doing it and making it up for them. That wasn't mentioned in the first hadith that we had mentioned. إذا مات ابن آدم قطع عمله إلا من ثلاث. And they said, well, any good deed that is a combination of ibadah, a combination of basically a contribution of perhaps money, maybe physical contribution, etc., then in that situation, we would basically say that yes, they can make up fast on their behalf, or they can make Hajj on their behalf, or even read Quran on their behalf, or even make istighfar on their behalf. Then therefore, yes, we will include, according to the second opinion, that it's not a bid'ah. The first opinion, absolutely bid'ah, and they'll be so ardent against it. Okay, let's see. This sister is saying that those older than us back in the days had less faith crisis. Yes, there were, and other crisis, and other issues, but I get what you mean. The crisis is different right now. Absolutely, absolutely. I'm doing this study about the change in faith in America specifically. And this study is part of my new PhD dissertation for my second PhD. And it's talking about in one of the chapters how faith in America, uh, changed even in Christianity. The way that they would hold on to faith, the way they would consider tradition, the way that they practiced, I guess, in the vision itself, like the view and how they viewed things and how they interpreted things, or even the practice and on a social dynamic, how that really had changed. And later on, it affected even on what they considered themselves as affiliated to. And that's why, right now we're seeing the rise in what they would consider themselves as, non-affiliated, or perhaps not adopting a particular religion, or consider themselves as agnostic, etc. So you're seeing that on the rise, and on the rise by far, by the way, on the rise by far. And it'd be really interesting. Maybe, inshallah, I'll share some of those studies to actually say not only is it happening to Christianity, but we're also seeing the Muslim community as well, especially with the younger generation. We're definitely seeing a lot of changes. It'll be really interesting. Inshallah, perhaps maybe we'll do a survey maybe and see, comparing the thoughts, it'd be really interesting to do a survey and to really see the younger generation, perhaps maybe ages maybe 15 to 26 maybe, how their practice was different, and seeing just those statistics probably in later the older generation. Maybe I would say 2012 was a key year, not only in the Muslim world during the Arab Spring, but it was a key year because of course, the introduction. You started getting iPhones becoming a big thing. You started seeing some type of globalization that was becoming more. Right now, believe it or not, I mean, in Malaysia, you have a younger generation, even in Malaysia, that does not speak even Malaysian and speak better English than their own country. If we're talking about a whole country, and even in their own country, you would hear the younger children are actually speaking in English and not in their Bahasa Malaysian language. So, what's going to happen to all these languages? And they're in their country. These kids are not in America, okay? They're in their own country, but you're seeing their own language is getting wiped out. So if this younger child who's watching, American movies, shows, and all of that, they're actually speaking with their parents in English, and they're speaking better English than their own traditional language, then when they grow up, 3 generations from now, this language, their traditional language, is going to be extinct. It's not going to be spoken anymore. It's going to be gone. And are we looking at that? I mean, what's going to happen? Okay, you're saying not only language, but you're also saying culture. Younger generation is definitely trying to act in a liberal culture, trying to adopt a certain style. Whose style? American style. What does that even mean? And where are the Americans going as well? Even Even if you are in America, the older generation is telling you, you know what, this is not, I'll tell you, as somebody that was born in the US, lived in the US, and if you were to compare the average teenager in the 80s compared to the average teenager right now, huge difference. Huge difference. This is not America that I know. And the younger generation would think that this is America. This is not America. You look at America back in the 80s, a huge difference compared to America right now. A lot of influences, a lot of changes, even the language itself. Many times I would say certain words and they'd be looking at me like, what does that word even mean? They don't even know what those words even mean anymore. It became a completely set of vocabulary, completely a completely new set of vocabulary, a completely new set of cultures, a completely new set of things. And certainly whether it's movies or whether it's social media or whether it's the indoctrination that the schools are doing, all of that is creating a completely set of new cultures. And this new culture is what now is becoming the trend through social media influencing the generations globally, by the way. Globally, you're seeing the younger generation, Malaysian, for example, younger generation, they'll they'll be acting in the different practices that you would see in America. How did it go that far? How did it get that influence? How did it reach this far? We are 14 hours away from the US. And it's a completely new heritage, a completely new place with a whole set of new challenges. But then you will see the younger generation is feeling a part of a completely different environment. That's a very scary thing. A completely new environment. I was watching a video yesterday. I don't know how it popped up. Yeah, I think it was, yeah. So anyhow, a group of women were on a graveyard reading Quran, regardless of bid'ah. That's not what I'm talking about right now. Regardless of bid'ah. So it was a group of women. They were reading Quran on this grave. Who knows who this person is, regardless of bid'ah or not. But then the kid, there was a child um who was there. They were almost 5 years old, and then they said to the dead person, Merry Christmas. And the video was, it seemed like maybe Malaysian, maybe Indonesian, but this kid who's only 5 years old basically decided to congratulate or I don't know, this dead person in a different way and say Merry Christmas. And these people seem like, Malaysians and Indonesians, they look very similar in many ways. And you could say, well, this is a new generation. This is a new generation coming in with a completely new culture, with a completely new mindset. All right. Said, Merry Christmas. I'm gonna do something different. Didn't do al-Fatiha like their bid'ah, okay? Didn't do like their Fatiha, or probably say Astaghfirullah and maybe say Allahu Akbar or something like that, but said Merry Christmas. This is a 5-year-old, okay? This is a almost 4 or 5 years old, okay? This is where, this is, I guess, this is one video that kind of, I guess, reflected perhaps what I was trying to say, that we're getting a new generation that is not necessarily connected to their Islam, but they're connected to a completely different environment that even the American government, even the American people, even the Christian people don't even know. It's a completely new set of atheism, agnosticism, a new set of a culture that emptied even if you were to talk about Christianity, it's emptied of Christianity. Even America, the right now, the common Christians, they're empty of any Christianity. They had most of them, in fact, 90% of them, never even read the Bible. They're just called Christian. That's it. But they know nothing about Christianity, nothing about Christianity. Absolutely nothing. So if you were saying it would be really dangerous if we are seeing later on, Muslims empty of their own Islam. We cannot say that, yo, this can't happen to us. Oh, yes, it can happen to us. Because at one point, we were empty of our own Islam. Yes, I'm optimistic. We are bringing in a new revival, but at the same time, this new revival contains a lot of what the hadith calls a dakhan. What is it, dakhan? Dakhan basically means something murky, something dark, something, think of it, dukhan, like when you make smoke and the smoke basically, fogs the area. Okay? That's a dakhan. So they think they're on the right path, but they had basically adopted a number of different sets of influences that it became so foggy they can't even see the light right. They're confusing their paths. فيه الدخن. What's the opposite of having dakhan? Holding on to the sunnah, holding on to Islam itself, the resources. That's how you will understand Islam. You want to understand Islam, you go back to those resources and not new interpretations that want to seem somehow inclusive. Because all of that political correctness, it's all about, yeah, I'm trying to be inclusive, trying to, respect everyone and not necessarily say the truth. Because in a postmodern culture, there's no truth, but one truth, that there's no truth. So therefore, you just are basically considering that no truth is objective and all truth is subjective. And that, hey, it's all going to be something that influenced you. You would see it that way, but it's not necessarily objective truth. That's what they would consider, that there's no such thing as objective truth. Allah understand. And we're seeing the younger generation is adopting this culture. It's pretty scary, to be honest. Pretty scary to see Muslims empty of their own Islam, tracing the same culture and the same influences, because at the end of the day, our children in America or in the West are actually attending the Western schools. They're, reading the same textbooks. They're watching the same basically things on social media. They're listening to the same types of music, et cetera. And it starts becoming the same influence, but perhaps maybe we're wearing a different cloak, but the influence is the same. Allah al-Musta'an. So what we really need to do is revive amongst ourselves, in our children and the other generations, revive, let's call it the Puritan, let's call it the resources, and going back to the resources of Quran and Sunnah and letting them know that the traditional Islam, or at least the Islam that traces back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, that that's the true Islam. And that there's no way that you can make a better Islam than the Islam that was delivered and revealed onto the Prophet ﷺ. There's no way that you can make a better Islam. And there's no way that you're going to make a better interpretation than the interpretation of the scholars that had mastered studying, reviewing, understanding the Islamic resources. No matter how smart you thought that you were, they had, one, access to those resources, better interpretation. They digested that information and that data better, and they definitely have a better interpretation than the influenced interpretation that you basically wanted to think of it as objective, when the truth of the matter, it is subjective and definitely influenced by a lot of these, whether liberal, existentialism, and individualism, postmodernism, atheist, the list goes on and on with those different isms that had influenced our interpretation. Allah al-Musta'an. So this is it. Inshallah. Oh, I actually promised that would end at 12:30. My bad. Okay, this is it. Inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. What I'm going to do right now, I am going to basically end the